It began as a quiet ripple. A few headlines. A handful of obscure threads. A short clip that seemed too strange to take seriously. But by morning, the silence around it had vanished. Former President Barack Obama had just made one of the most unusual public appearances of his post-presidency. It wasn't a rally. It wasn't a policy speech. It wasn't even a charity event. It was a closed-door panel, held under the banner of an international media summit, attended by press executives, political strategists, and technology firms. And it was there, behind tightly guarded doors, that something happened no one could have predicted. The footage should never have been released. But it was. At first, the video was only 6 seconds long. A poorly angled shot of Obama, seated on stage, speaking calmly. Then came the second clip, 30 seconds this time, and what it captured made people freeze. The former president spoke plainly. He talked about information control, not in abstract terms, in tactical ones. He said it was time for democratic governments to consider preemptive narrative shaping for national cohesion. It sounded clinical, until Karoline Leavitt got hold of it. The next morning, she stepped in front of a microphone. She wasn't holding a press pass. She wasn't at a news desk. She was standing on the steps outside a state capitol, flanked by a few aides and a small, confused group of reporters. Most assumed it was a local statement. Then she began to speak. Karoline did not raise her voice. She did not read from a teleprompter. She looked straight ahead and spoke with the clarity of someone who had no intention of backing down. She said the clip was real. She said the language used was deliberate. And she said that if a former president could speak openly about shaping public perception through institutional pressure, then Americans deserved to know exactly who was in on it. That sentence changed everything. Because unlike other commentators, Karoline did not speculate. She did not accuse. She listed names, timelines, communications that had already been made public, but never assembled into a single, undeniable pattern. She showed that the phrase preemptive narrative shaping was not invented on that stage. It had been seeded in white papers and think tank memos for nearly a decade. She cited universities, foundations, and advisory boards. She described how government officials had quietly met with social media platforms under the guise of safety, and how safety, in this context, often meant silence. Reporters didn't know what to say. They had expected outrage. What they got was documentation. The clip of her speech went viral within hours. Not because it was loud, but because it was steady, and because it was impossible to ignore. Karoline didn't say Obama had broken the law. She said he had revealed something far more disturbing, a quiet consensus among elites that truth itself was a tool to be managed. The backlash was immediate. Cable networks scrambled to reframe the summit footage. They claimed it was out of context. They said the former president had been misunderstood. But each clarification only added fuel to the story, because none of them denied the words. They only explained what they were supposed to mean. That explanation didn't work anymore. Not after Karoline showed the receipts. What came next was a silence louder than outrage. Mainstream outlets stopped saying her name. Guest invitations vanished. But online, her following doubled. Not because she provoked, but because she revealed. She posted a simple message the next morning. They want you to forget what you heard. Don't. It was retweeted more than 100,000 times. That afternoon, a well-known news anchor asked a quiet question on air. It was buried at the end of a segment and cut from the re-upload. But viewers caught it live. If what she's saying is false, why isn't anyone proving it wrong? That question still hasn't been answered. The calls started quietly. Not from journalists. From donors. From former colleagues. From party insiders who had always admired Karoline's discipline, her messaging, her instincts. They weren't angry. They were worried. They asked if she could soften the language. They asked if she could reframe it as a question instead of a statement. One advisor went so far as to suggest she post a follow-up tweet saying, "I probably misunderstood the context, but it still feels concerning." Karoline didn't respond. She didn't disappear either. She kept working. She met with young campaign staffers. She spoke at a local university, not about politics, but about the value of restraint in public leadership. And at every stop, someone asked her the same thing. Why are they trying so hard to make this go away? The answer wasn't complicated. The footage wasn't the problem. The problem was what Karoline had done with it. She hadn't attacked. She hadn't theorized. She had illuminated, and then walked away, letting the public decide what to make of it. That's what terrified them most. Because every attempt to reframe the clip only brought more attention to what had already been said. And every silence made it worse. It was a former White House correspondent who finally said it aloud. She wasn't speaking on a panel. She wasn't being recorded. She was just having coffee with a friend who happened to be recording from across the table. Her voice was tired. The truth is, Karoline didn't exaggerate, she said quietly. She underplayed it. She could have said a lot more. We all know that. That clip leaked, and it changed the conversation again. Now the question wasn't whether Karoline had gone too far. It was how far she had chosen not to go. Back in Washington, a closed-door meeting took place between a group of media consultants and digital platform executives. The agenda was phrased carefully. It said they were there to discuss virality boundaries. The phrase was vague on purpose, but the goal was clear. Karoline's posts had gained too much traction to be ignored. They weren't being flagged for misinformation. They weren't being labeled. So the next step was isolation. She wasn't banned. She was just deprioritized. Her content still existed, but it didn't travel. It didn't trend. It didn't show up in suggested feeds. Until someone noticed. It was a small account, an independent researcher. She posted side-by-side screenshots showing that Karoline's engagement had dropped 90% in 5 days. The post went viral. And just like that, the story shifted again. Now it wasn't just about Obama. It was about the architecture built to protect him, and how that same structure was quietly suppressing those who questioned it, not with censorship, but with disappearance. Karoline remained silent, not out of fear, out of strategy, because she knew something that few in her position ever remembered. You don't win a battle like this by shouting louder. You win by lasting longer. So she stopped posting for a week, not because she had been silenced, but because she wanted to see what happened when she said nothing at all. And the silence spoke volumes. Others began picking up the thread. A retired data engineer published a report showing patterns of algorithmic suppression across multiple platforms, all tied to users who had reshared Karoline's initial video. An independent journalist released a short film titled The Pattern, built entirely around 5 minutes of footage, Obama's words, Karoline's response, and the silence that followed. Even those who disagreed with her politically were beginning to speak up, because this wasn't about partisan lines anymore. It was about something deeper. The idea that a message can be erased not because it's false, but because it's inconvenient. And Karoline had refused to treat that as normal. It did not end with a headline. There was no dramatic apology, no televised retraction, no viral confession of wrongdoing. That was never going to happen. Not in a system that survives by making correction feel like collapse. Instead, it ended where all unsanctioned truths go, into the slow, steady current of public memory. Karoline never claimed victory. She never released a follow-up thread or issued a summary of events. In fact, she said almost nothing for 2 weeks. She focused on her work. She met with parents advocating for curriculum transparency. She listened to military spouses describing how digital censorship had impacted their support networks. She accepted an invitation from a podcast host she didn't agree with, because the invitation was respectful, and the story kept moving without her. A high school debate coach in Pennsylvania assigned her speech as part of a media literacy unit. A Canadian journalist used the clip in a lecture on the language of authority. A university in Eastern Europe translated the footage and screened it for students studying state propaganda. None of these efforts made headlines. But Karoline noticed them. She saved screenshots. She kept a quiet record. Because the goal had never been to go viral. It had been to leave a mark that could not be erased. And it had worked. The former president never addressed her by name. His team released a statement describing the summit remarks as a reminder of the complex relationship between democracy and communication. It was a sentence that said nothing. And yet, in the silence around it, more voices began asking a quiet question. If the words didn't mean what they sounded like, then why did they sound like they needed so much explanation? That question echoed in places no one expected. A former campaign aide published a column defending Karoline's right to question power. A progressive YouTuber with no ties to her politics admitted on air that she had called out something everyone else was too scared to touch. It wasn't unity. It was clarity. And in today's landscape, that was rarer than agreement. Karoline never demanded loyalty. She didn't ask for followers or fanfare. She didn't frame herself as a martyr or a whistleblower. She just kept showing up, calm, precise, unafraid to speak plainly, even when others demanded complication. In the weeks that followed, her team quietly released a timeline. No narration, no accusations, just dates, documents, transcripts, and quotes, all verifiable, all sourced. It was shared more than 1 million times, and it remained untouched by fact-checkers. Because there was nothing to correct, the footage spoke for itself. The silence around it said even more. Karoline never changed her tone. She never needed to, because she understood something that most public figures still don't. Power does not fear anger. Power fears patience. It fears the voice that doesn't shout, the hand that doesn't tremble, the witness who does not blink when told to look away. And on that day, on those steps, Karoline had become exactly that. Not a firebrand, not a victim, but a mirror. And what she reflected back to the system was something it could neither deny nor dismiss. Not because she was loud, but because she was right. And because, in the end, the truth didn't need her to win. It only needed her not to walk away. If this story moved you, reflect on this question. When silence becomes strategy, whose voice still dares to speak? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories that ask the hard questions the headlines won't, subscribe now. You're not alone in wanting to know what's real.